Good morning. Today I'm going to be reading from the letter to Father Victor White from C.G. Jung, dated October 5th, 1945. And I'm doing that because it's a very important contextual letter for understanding Dr. Jung's position vis-a-vis religion in general. And it was the beginning of a long correspondence between Dr. Jung and Father White, which led to Father White visiting Dr. Jung in Switzerland many times over the next decade or so. And so this is the very first letter. Remember that Father White had a midlife crisis about 1940, and he was a professor of dogmatic studies at the Dominican House Blackfriars at Oxford University. And he went to a Jungian analyst to assist him with his midlife crisis. And that resulted in a lot of interest by Father White in Dr. Jung's work. And hi, Miles, welcome. And unfortunately, World War II had already begun in Europe when the 1940 crisis occurred for Father White, and so he could not communicate with Dr. Jung for 5 years. And at the end of the war, by the time of the end of the war, he had written several pieces about his thinking as informed by Dr. Jung's thinking. And so he had sent Dr. Jung some pamphlets that described his new ideas. And so Dr. Jung is for the first time responding. Dr. Jung had written one earlier letter to Father White, but just acknowledged that he received the pamphlets and he hadn't looked at them yet. So this is the first substantive letter from Dr. Jung to Father White. Good morning, Sean, or good morning, I suppose, and welcome. So today I'm reading from C.G. Jung Letters, C.G. Jung Letters, Volume 1, 1906 to 1950, and this is published by Princeton University Press, and I'm reading from page 383 of this volume. My dear Father White, 5 October 1945. In the meantime, I have finished reading the pamphlets you kindly have sent to me. My first reaction was, what a pity that you live in England and that I don't have you at my elbow when I am blundering in the wide field of theological knowledge. You must grant me attenuating circumstances, though. Besides all the other things I had to learn, I arrived only very late at the treasure house of patristic wisdom. So late, in fact, that my limited powers didn't suffice anymore to acquire all that would be needed to elucidate and explain the perplexities of modern psychological experience. Excuse the irreverential pun. You are to me a white raven, inasmuch as you are the only theologian I know of who inasmuch as you are the only theologian I know to who has I'm misreading this. Inasmuch as you are the only theologian I know of who has really understood something of what the problem of psychology in our present world means. You have seen its enormous implications. I cannot tell you how glad I am that I know a man, a theologian, who is conscientious enough to weigh my opinions on the basis of a careful study of my writings. My temperamental empiricism has its reasons. I began my career with repudiating everything that smelt of belief. That explains my critical attitude in my psychology of the unconscious. You should know that this book was written by a psychiatrist for the purpose of submitting the necessary material to his psychiatric colleagues, material which would demonstrate to them the importance of religious symbolism. My audience then was a thoroughly materialistic crowd, and I would have defeated my own ends if I had set out with a definite creed or with definite metaphysical assertions. And there's a footnote here. Jung's early association with the psychoanalytic school came to an end with the publishing of Psychology of the Unconscious in 1912. And there was a letter to Dr. Freud about that. So let me go back. I was not, and I did not want to be anything else but one of them. My principle was always not to seek the place where I might do something useful, but to do it where I actually was. I was impressed with their utter lack of knowledge of matters of symbolism, and I wanted to do my best to provide it for them. Only too late, I have discovered that it wasn't my colleagues at all, but very different people who became interested in my work. I have tried to accommodate myself to the psychiatric and medical mind, hardened and often made cynical through the relentless onslaught of brutal and cruel facts and the depravity of mankind. Page 384 now. Thus, when I said that God is a complex, I meant to say, whatever he is at least a very tangible complex. You can say he is an illusion, but he is at least a psychological fact. I surely never intended to say he is nothing else but a complex. Naturally, when my book got into the hands of readers outside my psychiatric sphere, they read it with very different eyes, hence many mistakes. My book was originally nothing but a reprint from a psychiatric periodical, which was supposed to be read by doctors chiefly. Concerning my nosological standpoint, at that time, please see note 42, page 307 of the English edition of Psychology of the Unconscious. You have rendered justice to my empirical and practical standpoint throughout. I consider this a very meritorious act, since most of my philosophically or theologically minded readers overlook my empiricism completely. I never allow myself to make statements about the divine entity, since that would be a transgression beyond the limit of science. It would therefore be unfair to criticize my opinions as if they were philosophical. It would therefore be unfair to criticize my opinions as if they were a philosophical system. My personal view in this matter is that man's vital energy, or libido, is the divine pneuma all right, and it was this conviction which it was my secret purpose to bring into the vicinity of my colleagues' understanding. When you talk to scientists, you cannot start with a religious creed. You have to show the facts and let them draw their own conclusions. You also cannot say that man's goal is actually realized in God. You must again show facts demonstrating in what the goal is realized. What you can show is that what you can show in this respect is the symbol of the self, a well-defined psychological phenomenon which anybody may call God, but the scientists cannot prove it to be God. As a scientist, I must give a wide berth to anything dogmatic or metaphysical, since it is not the scientist's task to preach the gospel. But it is precisely what the theologian has to say, namely that the dogma is the hitherto most perfect answer to and formulation of the most relevant items in the objective psyche, and that God has worked all these things in man's soul. The scientist, however, cannot prove such an assertion. He can only try his best in his limited sphere. And thank you, Conan, for giving Sean that pointer. That's a good pointer. I actually never think of the Egyptian Book of the Dead because my wife practices Tibetan Buddhism, and there's a lot of books about the dead in Tibetan Buddhism. Anyway, I'm carrying on. I sympathize fully with you when you say, quote, "The task before us is gigantic indeed," unquote. There's a footnote. Apparently, Father White had said this in a pamphlet called Psychotherapy and Ethics, page 298. It is enormous, and I marvel at the intellectual pachydermia of those who ought to know better and who didn't take notice apparently, or worse, who try to get rid of the octopus by the most futile arguments. I have frequent discussions with Catholic as well as Protestant theologians. As a rule, they are astonishingly innocent of actual psychological experience, and often they seem to have forgotten the wisdom of the fathers. It is all very well to have it summarized most beautifully by St. Thomas Aquinas, but when it comes to the interpretation of man's living soul, you need actual knowledge. It is far from me to depreciate concepts and formulas. On the contrary, I envy you and all those enjoying full possession of scholastic philosophy, and I would surely be among the first to welcome an explicit attempt to integrate the findings of psychology into the ecclesiastical doctrine. I am sure I would draw the greatest benefit from it. I am grateful for every hint you dropped in your papers. I was, for instance, most interested in what you said about the problem of the third person. I wish you would enlighten me about this subject a bit more. Could you tell me about the sources where I can find more enlightenment? You can perhaps imagine my feelings of inadequacy when I have to tackle such a problem at short notice. It is usually so that I keep quiet for years about such intricate matters as, for instance, the Trinity. But all of a sudden the subject comes up in a discussion or in a lecture and somebody deals with it in a really inadequate way. Then I feel somebody ought to say something more to the point, and I am launched utterly unprepared, only supported by my experience with only supported by my experience with practically nothing on the other, the theological side. There I would need some solid theological help. I realize that it can only come from the Catholic side, as the faith alone standpoint of the Protestant has lost the tradition of the doctrine too much to be useful in disentangling the knots in the empirical material. This collaboration has been realized to a certain extent as I enjoy the most valuable help of Professor Hugo Rayner, Society of Jesus at Innsbruck University. He is an authority on hermeneutics of the Fathers, but I see him only rarely, and it is most difficult to find out how far his psychological understanding reaches. I think he is too careful. Do you know the Eranos yearbooks? Do you read German? There is stuff for you. If you read German, I should like to send you my book, Psychology and Alchemy, much better than the badly translated Integration of the Personality, which was forced out of my hands by the thrift and pep of an American publisher. Okay. There will be an English edition of Psychology and Alchemy within the next year. I owe you special thanks for kindly remembering my 70th birthday. The Eranos Circle has dedicated to me a commemoration in which you will find a brilliant paper by Rayner about Moly and Mandragora, and an equally remarkable essay by Layard on the subject of primitive marriage classes and the virgin archetype. And that's a reference to John Layard, The Incest Taboo and the Virgin Archetype, from the Eranos Yearbook, Volume 12, 1945. You accuse me of repudiating the divine transcendence altogether. This is not quite correct. I merely omit it. Since I am unable to prove it, I don't preach. I try to establish psychological facts. I can confirm and prove the interrelation of the God image with other parts of the psyche, but I cannot go further without committing the error of a metaphysical assertion, which is far beyond my scope. I am not a theologian, and I have nothing to say about the nature of God. There is no place for subjective confessions in science. Whatever I say about God is said about the image expressus verbis, and the image is relative, as you yourself have stated. It is again a matter of to whom you talk. My public does not consist of theologians, but of utterly worldly, educated people of our day. When you talk of God, they do not know of what you talk, since such ideas have been dismissed long ago as nebulous fantasies. I show facts to them, and not metaphysical assertions which they cannot grasp. If I were talking to peasants, I certainly would talk about God, since I know that they know of what I am talking. It is of the highest importance that the educated and enlightened public should know religious truth as a thing living in the human soul, and not as an abstruse and unreasonable relic of the past. People must be taught to see where they come in. Otherwise, you never bridge the gulf between the educated mind and the world of dogmatic ideas, which they comprehend nowhere, and which, moreover, offend their reason. If the Reformers, for instance, had ever understood what the Holy Mass is, or what the rites in general stand for, they would certainly not have abandoned it. The appalling lack of understanding threatens the Christian religion with complete oblivion. You cannot preach to a man who does not understand the language. To shout and to repeat makes no sense. But you feel, as I do, But you feel, as I do, that the theologian ought to learn a new language. What if St. Paul had talked in the marketplace as if he were in a synagogue? Understanding begins with the individual mind, and this means psychology. It is a gigantic task, indeed, to create a new approach to an old truth. More than once I have put the question to my theological friends, what about new wine in old skins? The old way of interpreting has itself to be interpreted, this time with the help of science. This method can reach the modern mind, as I have seen in many cases. I do not combat the Christian truth. I am only arguing with the modern mind. We have known for long and sufficiently well how things ought to be, but we do not know how to bring them about. This is my main concern. People are not to be lured anymore by the promises of heaven and hell. They want to understand. I cannot tell my patient. I have to seek him, and I must learn his language and think his thoughts until he knows that I understand him correctly. Then only is he ready to understand me, and at the same time the strange language of the unconscious that tells him of eternal truths, and incidentally he will discover that he has heard similar things before. That's the practical way, but to get there you have to avoid suggestions. Well, a long letter, not my style at all. It has made an exception in your case, my dear father, because it has appreciated your conscientious and far-sighted work. Yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. When he's referring to it here, I think he's referring to the self, to his own self. And one thing I would observe for anybody that's watching this is that one place to learn a lot about Jungian psychology is by buying the 2-volume set, C.G. Jung Letters, 1906 to 1950. That's volume 1, and volume 2 is 1951 to 1961. And what happens in these letters is that Dr. Jung explains himself much more clearly than he does in some of his scholarly works. So I would urge you, if you are interested in Jungian psychology, to acquire copies of these books. You can also find electronic versions of them in the group DropBox. So if you are not a member of our group, DropBox, you can send email to skip.conover@gmail.com on a standard email address, which is required by DropBox, and then I can add you to that group. But I was able to buy this book and volume 2 on used books on Amazon, and I buy it on used books because I don't want to feel bad about marking them up. And as you see, I mark up many of my books very heavily. So let me look at your comments. Good morning, Death Metal Mason. Sean says, do you think society needs to detach more from dogma to pragmatism? I think that we need to assimilate dogma with pragmatism and with psychology. I think that's Dr. Jung's message. We have to assimilate what has come before, because remember, there have only been about 150 or 200 generations from the time of the Old Testament. And so we are not so different from the men and women who lived in Christ's time or even in Moses' time. And those people knew something too. And those people made it possible through the Bible to create Western civilization. And I had this insight the other night as I was talking on the group session that all of civilization is a reflection of the fact that the human species does tend to decide for the good as opposed to the evil. I'm not saying that the evil doesn't exist. Certainly Dr. Jung would whip me severely about the head and shoulders, because he believed, and I believe, that evil is a great power in the world. But the fact that the cathedral in Chartres, for example, or Notre Dame, or any of our great churches around the world, and the many faithful members of all religions exist in the world is a reflection of the fact that, as on balance, people have decided for the good. And I believe that we will continue to do so, because the alternative is to destroy ourselves, and that's not so hard these days, because God has put into our hands the ability to destroy all life on earth. So and in fact, I had a bookmark in this letter. I happen to have this bookmark, and this bookmark is from the hardbound edition of Man and His Symbols, which was a book that Dr. Jung expressly wanted written for the layman. If you haven't read it, you should. You can find an electronic version of the book in the Dropbox, but on page 110, in Dr. Jung's own hand, so he had written this section. And one of the most important messages that he has for individuals appears on page 101. And because this section was written only 10 days before his death, we can assume that this was a message that he felt was extremely important to say to the rest of us. So on page 101 is this paragraph. As any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs in face of the present condition of the world. And I think that's quite a profound quote. There's a couple of other things that I underlined here. I wouldn't say they're less important. But it's talking about the instrument of the human mind, and this is literally the final paragraphs of what he was saying. Whatever the unconscious may be, it is a natural phenomenon producing symbols that prove to be meaningful. We cannot expect someone who has never looked through a microscope to be an authority on microbes. In the same way, no one who has not made a serious study of natural symbols can be considered a competent judge in this matter. But the general undervaluation of the human soul is so great that neither the great religions, nor the philosophies, nor scientific rationalism have been willing to look at it twice, in spite of the fact that the Catholic Church admits the occurrence of dreams sent by God. Most of its thinkers make no serious attempt to understand dreams. I doubt whether there is a Protestant treatise or doctrine that would stoop so low as to admit the possibility that the voice of God might be perceived in a dream. But if a theologian really believes in God, by what authority does he suggest that God is unable to speak through dreams? I have spent more than half a century in investigating natural symbols, and I have come to the conclusion that dreams and their symbols are not stupid and meaningless. On the contrary, dreams provide the most interesting information for those who take the trouble to understand their symbols. The results, it is true, have little to do with such worldly concerns as buying and selling, but the meaning of life is not exhaustively explained by one's business life, nor is the deep desire of the human heart answered by a bank account. In a period of human history when all available energy is spent on the investigation of nature, very little attention is paid to the essence of man, which is his psyche. Although many researches are made into its conscious functions, but the really complex and unfamiliar part of the mind from which the symbols are produced is still virtually unexplored. It seems almost incredible that though we receive signals from it every night, deciphering these communications seems too tedious for any but a very few people to be bothered with it. Man's greatest instrument, his psyche, is little thought of, and it is often directly mistrusted and despised. It's only psychological too often means it is nothing. Where exactly does this immense prejudice come from? We have obviously been so busy with the question of what we think we entirely forget to ask what the unconscious psyche thinks about us. The ideas of Sigmund Freud confirmed for most people the existing contempt for the psyche. Before him, it had been merely overlooked and neglected. It has now become a dump for moral refuge. So one of the last things he writes, there's a little bit more, one more paragraph. This is the last paragraph he wrote in his life that we know of. This modern standpoint is surely one-sided and unjust. It does not even accord with the known facts. Our actual knowledge of the unconscious shows that it is a natural phenomenon and that, like nature herself, it is at least neutral. It contains all aspects of human nature, light and dark, beautiful and ugly, good and evil, profound and silly. The study of individual as well as collective symbolism is an enormous task and one that has not yet been mastered. But a beginning has been made at least. The early results are encouraging, and they seem to indicate an answer to many so far unanswered questions of present-day mankind. That's pretty profound considering what's happening to us in our world these days. So, for what it's worth, let me go back to some of your comments here. Sean says, if so, do you think it will have consequences like Nietzsche spoke of, Well, it's already had conscious consequences, like Nietzsche spoke of. And he says, I believe we still need some source of stability, but maybe I'm wrong. It could sway back and forth to balance again. Well, Dr. Jung felt that the Nietzschean consequences were reflected in World Wars I and II, among other things. And Conan says the relationship between beauty and chaos will always need to coexist and shall not be at all, or shall not be at all. Do you think that the competency hierarchy creates a distortion within our society? And, obviously, Dr. Jung felt that any rigid order or dogma would ultimately be undercut. And we keep adjusting. I mean, things keep getting built up, and then they get broken down and get built up again with more knowledge in the future. Well, it says, always remember Jung's definition of religion, what a person attends to. My religion now is Toastmasters. Good. Student of rhythm, I've had dreams that saved my life. I think a lot of us have had dreams that have saved our lives in many ways, both daydreams and both night dreams and daydreams. Sean says, this reminds me of the Aztecs holding everything sacred, but also sacrificing human life. What happens with too much dogma, but also could commune with the divine? Well, Sean, I would just refer you to this book, The New God Image, by Edward Edinger, in which he talks about the 6 major stages in the evolution of religion. And specifically, he's talking about the Western God image. And so he says, these are the following: animism, in which the God image is an animistic one; matriarchy; hierarchical polytheism; tribal monotheism; universal monotheism; and number 6, the discovery of the psyche, individuation. These stages form an historical sequence. At the same time, these historical stages are also layers of the collective unconscious in the individual psyche. It means that if we had some method at our disposal by which we could peel away various layers of the collective God image, starting with our most modern mentality, we could work our way back theoretically through these historical layers down to the most elemental one. It is not just a historical exercise. History is not the primary interest of the analyst. The individual psyche is the primary interest. In the course of studying the phenomena of the collective unconscious as manifest in the individual psyche, we are obligated to look into historical parallels, because history has deposited its vestiges, its residues, so to speak, in the collective unconscious of humanity. These stages will be looked at in turn, starting from the bottom, remembering that if one is involved in an individual analysis, one starts from the top and works down, but with a historical survey, one starts from the bottom and works up. If one is destined to reach the level of psychological development called individuation, the psychic level number 6, and if development proceeds without serious obstacles, then in an approximate way, one will have gone through these various stages. And that is from Roman numeral page 15 of the introduction to this book. And this book, the electronic version of it, can be found in the Dropbox. So I urge you to take a look at it, because the next several pages actually cover the full discussion of those steps in the evolution of religion. And what Dr. Edinger was saying here is that we all go through these stages, and the Aztecs were more animist than we are today, but it doesn't mean we don't have an Aztec substrate within each of our psyches. That's the point. And Student of Rhythm says, "Hi Mason, I've long wondered how much to share. I could say that in fact one of them involved finding a special book and being told it was mine." Well, if it's yours, then good chance that it is telling you something about, maybe about what your life can or should become. And well, anyway, let me just mention a book that I'm currently reading that I think is useful, and that is, it's a book by Anne Ulanoff, and it is called Madness and Creativity. Madness and Creativity by Dr. Anne Belford Ulanoff, and it is available on Audible, so I purchased it and I'm listening to it now. It's quite profound, and so I urge you to, if you have time or you need something to listen to while you're driving, that would be a good one. And Miles says, "I am a Lilliputian," and Dr. Edinger said, compared to Dr. Jung, we are all Lilliputians. And I've just been reading, I received last week, as some of you know, Dr. Jung's History of Psychology from his ETH lectures, which is a new series of books being published. There are 8 volumes going to come out. The first volume is out, and it's C.G. Jung, The History of Psychology. And one of the things it says in that introduction is that there are still 100,000 pages of typescript that has not been translated and published of Dr. Jung's work. 100,000 pages. And there are 35,000 letters that have not yet been published. So we have a lot to learn yet. and anybody would be a Lilliputian compared to that. Now, in fairness, there was no email in those days, so every one of Dr. Jung's communications had to be done in writing with a stenographer and the whole smear. And today we can just knock out a lot of emails to our friends very quickly. And so but still, I don't know if any of us have gotten up to that level yet. I know that I never delete an email, so let me just give you a sense of it here.
Against filthy and proud thoughts and the carelessness of Hermas in chastising his.
Anyway, Gmail is saying that I have 467,189 emails that I have not looked at. Okay, now that includes all kinds of notifications that I get from Twitter and other places. So I get lots of email. I get 200 to 300 emails a day, and sometimes I do miss email that people send me. So if you send me something and I don't respond, please send something again. But I've learned to just scan through my email and not to open ones that I think I know what they're about. For example, Twitter notifications, I get 100 or 200 of those a day. And anyway, My wife told me about a funny Twitter comment last night. Apparently, Ann Coulter made a comment on Twitter that, quote, Kansas is dead for me now, unquote. And some wag had commented back to her, oh, Ann, Kansas has been dead for you ever since a house dropped on your sister. I can't help but be amused by that one. So Sean says, Conan asks, has it been written or needs to be? I'm not quite sure what you're referring to, Conan, so maybe you could be more explicit there. Sean says, would you rather be able to focus on one specific problem and be unaware of every other, or be aware and unable to focus? So wouldn't focus or attention be the first step to society? I suppose that focus and attention is certainly the first step to society, because otherwise you're just reacting instinctually and you're not differentiating. This is where logos comes in. Obviously we need logos, and so the two sides of it are form and chaos. And we have Dr. Jordan Peterson offering us lots of form, but we need chaos in our lives too, because otherwise you don't get new things. I mean, let's take a child. Once your wife conceives a child, that means there's going to be chaos in your life, because infants are wild animals and they have to be educated, and so you need both. And so yes, you focus on what's the immediate problem today and solve that, and then go on from there. We are problem-solving creatures, and I find that I am having to solve problems every day, multiple problems every single day. And, some of them are small and some of them are big. And we have to be able to have enough ego so that we can react and not be crushed by those problems. That's the nature of life as an adult, is to be a problem solver. And a mature adult is a person who isn't overwhelmed by life, which can be quite cruel. Miles says, Aztecs might have been actually performing a kind form of euthanasia, just suggesting an alternative possibility. Miles, I think you should read The Masks of God by Joseph Campbell. And by the way, that reminds me, so the first volume of The Masks of God is called Primitive Psychology, and it's pretty amazing to read about what primitives did. But I also, since I mentioned the Aranos yearbook, a number of the Aranos yearbooks were edited by Joseph Campbell, and this is one issue, which is The Mystic Vision, Papers from the Aranos yearbooks, edited by Joseph Campbell. And this is volume 6, and it's called The Mystic Vision. And so various thought leaders from around the world were meeting at for the Aranos conference in northern Italy, beginning in about 1930. And there now are something like 65 or 70 of these yearbooks, but it's worth knowing about it. I just did a search this morning on Amazon for Aranos Yearbook, and I found that there are quite a number of them that are there, and many of them are edited by Joseph Campbell. So I urge you to take a look at that. Thank you, student of rhythm, for your response. Conan says that was a reference to the book in Student of Rhythm Dream. Has it been written or needs to be? I'll leave it at that conversation between the two of you. Miles, The Masks of God is actually a 4-volume set. You can get it in used books from Amazon, which I would recommend. But I have a complete set. In fact, I've had 2 complete sets because I read them so thoroughly and for so long that they literally fell apart on me and I had to buy another set. But if any of you are interested in art or the arts of any kind, whether it's dancing or painting or poetry or whatever, I urge you especially to get volume 4 of The Masks of God, which talks about creative mythology. And it's a really profound book, and it's a book that literally came apart in my hands. I used it so much over the years. And so anybody that's an artist or thinking of being creative in any way, and we all should be thinking about being creative, you should look at that volume 4 of The Masks of God. So, I'm trying to decide whether I should respond student rhythm or not. I think it is true that your unconscious is giving you a new writing as needed. So to the extent that that's a useful comment, I'll leave it at that. Now, I have an appointment that I have to deal with today, so I'm sorry I have to cut you all off and go on to something else. But thank you for joining me this morning, and I'll be back again soon. So take care.